Story 1. Hayfields and Horses, the Quiet Laws of Medieval Iceland. The medieval Icelanders, living on their windswept island at the edge of the North Atlantic, thought a great deal about hay. If you were to walk across the landscape in the 12th century, you would not find stone castles or great cities. Instead, you would see farms, low turf houses pressed against the earth for warmth, with outbuildings scattered nearby, and fields carefully set aside for the cutting of grass. To a modern observer, this may seem unimpressive, but to those who lived then, hay was survival. Without it, the livestock would not live through the winter, and without livestock, neither would the people. The law codes of medieval Iceland, the Gragas, written in the 13th century, contain endless provisions about hay. They tell you how to measure it, how to divide it, who could claim it, and what penalties awaited those who cut grass on another's field. These laws were not written down until later, but they existed in oral form long before. They were recited at the Althing, the great national assembly, where disputes were aired and sometimes resolved. The sheer detail of these laws reminds us that the ordinary governed life more strictly than the extraordinary. While sagas tell of battles, duels, and betrayals, the law codes tell of hay. Imagine the careful work of haymaking. Scythes cutting down tall grass during the brief summer, men and women stacking it into heaps, and then storing it in barns to last through the long frost. The work was backbreaking, yet utterly necessary. A miscalculation, cutting too little, losing a stack to wet weather, could mean hunger months later. The laws therefore sought to prevent theft and negligence. For instance, if one farmer cut grass on another's land, even by mistake, there were fines to be paid. The penalties were not only monetary but could affect one's honor and standing in the community. Iceland was a small society. Reputation was as binding as any coin. Horses appear throughout these codes as well. Unlike cows, which provided milk and meat, horses were not typically eaten. They were working animals, necessary for travel across the rugged terrain. A man might own only a few, and disputes over their ownership could linger for years. The law codes defined the markings on a horse, recording the patterns of color and shape, so that ownership could be proven. Even a misplaced foal could become the subject of lengthy legal arguments. In a society without written deeds for animals, memory and witness testimony mattered most. What is striking in these texts is their attention to the dull but essential. They tell us less about kings or battles and more about how one neighbor should treat another's fence line. They reveal a people constantly negotiating survival, balancing individual need against communal stability. Hay and horses may seem mundane, but in Iceland, they were lifeblood. When you think about law today, you might imagine thick books filled with statutes or bustling courthouses. In medieval Iceland, the law was a living memory, carried in the minds of those who recited it aloud. The law was not distant. It was present in every scythe swing, every haystack piled against the cold, every horse tethered in a field. It was a constant reminder that survival required cooperation, and that disputes, if left unresolved, could threaten the fragile balance of life on the island. And so, as we begin our journey into these quiet laws, we might ask, why did a society with no kings, no standing army, and no castles choose to pour so much energy into regulating hay and horses? What does this tell us about the shape of their lives, and what can we learn from the ordinariness of their concerns? Let us return to the windswept farms and rolling grasslands of medieval Iceland. We left off with a question: why such detailed attention to hay and horses? To understand this, we must go deeper into the social and environmental fabric of the Icelandic Free State and how law and survival were intertwined. The economy of grass. In Iceland, hay was not just fodder, it was a form of economic measurement. Unlike in parts of Europe where coinage circulated widely, medieval Iceland had little minted currency. Wealth was measured in livestock, especially cows and sheep, and by extension, in the ability to feed them. A man's status was not determined solely by what he owned, but by what he could sustain through the winter. Thus, hayfields in Old Norse became one of the most closely guarded resources. The Gragaz outlines very specific processes for maintaining and defending one's hayfield boundaries. Disputes over land were not just about acreage, they were about the right to cut and claim hay. Land boundaries were typically marked by cairns, small piles of stones, or natural features like rivers, boulders, or specific trees. These markers were not always precise. Frost heaving, floods, and the movement of sheep could shift or obscure them, leading to endless disputes about where one farm ended and another began. When a man accused his neighbor of cutting grass on his land, the matter would be brought to the thing, the local or regional assembly. Here, neighbors would testify, recalling the placement of markers from memory. Sometimes, legal witnesses would be asked to walk the disputed land, pointing out what had long been considered the boundary. The Gragaz required 3 witnesses for a proper claim, and they had to be men of reputable standing. If fewer were available, the burden of proof became harder. Such disputes could escalate. If a man continued to cut grass on another's land despite warnings, he could be fined or even outlawed, a serious punishment that effectively made one a non-person in society. In extreme cases, families feuded over land and hay, passing grievances down through generations. All of this for grass. But hay was not just for feeding animals. It was, in many ways, the foundation of the Icelandic economy. A rich hayfield could support more animals. More animals meant more milk, meat, wool, and skins, essential trade goods in a society where most manufactured items, such as iron tools or cloth, had to be imported. A man with poor hayfields might barter for winter fodder, placing himself in debt. Thus, hay was not merely agricultural. It was also social and political capital. Horses and the law of markings. Horses, too, were regulated with painstaking detail. The Icelandic horse, short, strong, and resilient, was uniquely suited to the country's rugged terrain. Every farm had at least 1 or 2. They pulled sleds in winter and carried riders across rivers and lava fields. Horses were never used en masse in warfare. Rather, they were work companions and travel aids. And because they were so important, their theft or misidentification could spark serious conflict. The Gragaz includes descriptions of horse markings: blisi, lesta, skjadar, denoting facial stripes, socks, and piebald coloring. These were critical identifiers in the absence of branding or tattoos. In some cases, entire community gatherings were held to review ownership claims. This was not mere bureaucratic formality. In a land with few written records, memory and oral testimony were everything. If a horse went missing, the law required the owner to announce it at 3 separate things in successive weeks in front of witnesses. This gave others a chance to dispute or support the claim. If no one stepped forward and the horse was later found in another man's pasture, the law treated it as theft unless proven otherwise. The burden of proof rested heavily on reputation. If you were known to be honest, your word counted. If not, the consequences could be steep. The law was so careful about horses that it even included provisions for foals born on shared grazing land. Who the mother belonged to, and where she had been pastured, became part of complex legal assessments. In some cases, people brought forth others who had witnessed the mating of 2 horses, or had seen a foal being born. These dull details mattered deeply in determining property and rights. There were also rules about how long a stray horse could be kept. If a man found a horse wandering near his land and took it in, he was obligated to report it, publicly and promptly. Failure to do so could lead to a legal case against him. This balance between community and individual property underscores a recurring theme in Icelandic legal thought: shared survival demanded personal responsibility. The lawspeaker and the living law. All of this depended on a remarkable institution, the Lögreglumaður, or lawspeaker. Iceland had no king, no central authority. Instead, the lawspeaker was chosen to serve a 3-year term, during which he was responsible for memorizing and reciting a portion of the law at each annual Althing gathering. There was no written law for much of early Icelandic history. Instead, the lawspeaker relied on memory. The Gragaz was eventually written down in the 13th century, likely after the conversion to Christianity and under influence from the Norwegian crown. But before that, the law lived in people's minds and mouths. This oral tradition meant that the law speaker had immense influence. He didn't just recite law, he interpreted it. If a matter arose that was unclear or a case came up for which no precedent was known, the law speaker might render judgment based on consensus or moral reasoning. In this way, the law adapted slowly to changing conditions, much like the people it governed. This also meant that legal stability depended heavily on social memory. If 3 witnesses forgot a boundary marker or misremembered the color pattern of a horse, a case could be lost. And unlike in modern systems, there was no appeal beyond the community. A lost case might mean real material loss, less hay, fewer animals, or even the end of a farmstead. And yet this system endured for centuries. It worked because it had to. The harsh environment allowed little room for disorder. People cooperated because conflict was costly. Even minor disputes, if unresolved, could lead to feuds, blood vengeance, or exile. Thus, the intricate rules about hay and horses were not excessive, they were essential. The ordinary as the framework of survival. Reading the Gragas today can feel like paging through a farmer's ledger or a set of municipal regulations. There are rules about stacking hay so it doesn't rot, about fencing livestock properly, about not letting your horse graze on another man's land. And yet these boring laws carried with them the weight of survival. Every rule points to a hard-won lesson. Every fine or punishment reflects some earlier failure. When a man's sheep wandered into his neighbor's unfenced field and the neighbor killed them, the resulting dispute might have led to bloodshed. The law stepped in to codify acceptable responses, replacing vendetta with compensation. This wasn't just law for its own sake, it was law as memory. Every rule had a story behind it, whether recorded or not. And every Icelandic farmer, in learning the law, was also learning the stories of his people, the tensions and compromises that had allowed the island society to persist. And so the hayfields were not just fields. They were places of memory, regulation, and caution. The horses were not just animals. They were walking testimonies, their markings etched into legal proceedings and neighborly arguments. And the law was not a distant code, but a lived structure, shaping every aspect of daily life, from the stacking of hay to the claim of a foal. But what happened when the law itself was no longer enough? As power shifted and foreign influence grew, how did these carefully balanced systems of oral law and community enforcement adapt or fail too? What came next, when the medieval Icelanders faced not just disputes among themselves, but pressure from beyond the island? As the medieval centuries wore on, Iceland's quiet, law-governed existence began to strain under pressures both internal and external. While the Gragas remained a bedrock of life in the Free State era, forces beyond hayfields and horses began to reshape Icelandic society. In this final section, we explore how a system built on oral law, communal memory, and survival-centric regulation responded or failed to respond to the slow creep of change. The slow decline of the Free State. The Icelandic Commonwealth, or Free State, existed from roughly 930 CE to 1262 CE. It was a remarkable experiment in stateless governance, operating without a central executive authority. The annual Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments, was where laws were declared and disputes settled. Law speakers recited statutes from memory. Chieftains, Gathar, negotiated alliances and judgments, and society largely governed itself. But Iceland was not immune to broader geopolitical realities. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the island's ties to Norway deepened, driven by trade, religion, and kinship. Ships from Norway brought timber, iron, and luxury goods in exchange for wool, skins, and dried fish. With them came a growing cultural influence, especially from the church and royal authority. The Gragas, once the dominion of local assemblies and chieftains, began to look increasingly archaic. Its detailed provisions for hayfields and horses stood in contrast to a church that introduced new ideas of divine justice and sin, and a Norwegian crown that favored codified, royal law. The concept of outlawry, once a communal punishment for serious offenses, began to lose effectiveness as Icelanders looked to foreign kings for support and enforcement. The law, once based on oral tradition and mutual memory, now faced a challenge. How do you govern when the laws are no longer shared by all, or when their enforcement depends on outside authority? The Jonsbok and the royal shift. In 1262, the Commonwealth formally ended when Iceland entered into a union with the Kingdom of Norway through the Old Covenant, Gamli Satmali. This agreement marked the beginning of royal rule and the end of Icelandic legal independence. A new law code was introduced, the Jarnsitha in 1271, and then the Jonsbok in 1281, named after John Einarsson, who helped draft it under the direction of King Magnus VI of Norway. Unlike the Graggas, which grew out of oral tradition and communal values, the Jonsbok was a royal law, written down from the outset and heavily influenced by continental and ecclesiastical legal practices. It retained some elements of the older codes, including property law and dispute resolution mechanisms, but its tone and framework were starkly different. Where Graggas focused on practical survival, what to do when a horse wandered, or how to stack hay, the Jonsbok introduced a broader moral and theological dimension. It integrated Christian ethics, imposed more severe punishments for moral failings, and diminished the role of the chieftains in legal matters. But even within this new code, the old concerns lingered. There were still provisions about livestock, land boundaries, and the handling of stray animals. Iceland, after all, remained an isolated agricultural society. Despite shifts in governance, daily life continued to revolve around the same seasonal rhythms. Hay had to be cut, horses still wandered, and the cold still came every winter, unbothered by politics. Legal memory in a changing world. What was lost, however, was the sense of communal ownership over the law. The old system, for all its flaws, had relied on social cohesion. Everyone knew the law or knew someone who did. The law was recited aloud in the hearing of many. When decisions were made, they were made in public. Under royal law, justice became more bureaucratic. Written documents replaced spoken memory. Judges, often church-trained, took on greater power. Fines were increasingly paid to the crown, not to the victim. And in this transformation, something was left behind: the connection between law and landscape, between rule and relationship. The Graggas had paid close attention to place. Its laws were rooted in physical reality: the stone that marked a hayfield's edge, the path a horse took across the highlands, the smell of wet grass in the barn. The new codes were more abstract, more distant. They brought stability, yes, but also detachment. And yet, even centuries later, echoes of the Graggas can be found in rural Icelandic life. Some of the old field boundaries are still visible. Oral memory persisted in farming communities, where stories of land and lineage continued to guide decisions. The Icelandic horse, still purebred and hardy, remains a source of pride. And the hayfields, though now often mechanized, are still tended with care born of centuries of necessity. Reflection: what the quiet laws tell us. What then can we take from these dusty codes, these boring but vital rules about grass and animals? First, that the mundane is where the real drama of history often lies. Survival isn't always about heroism. It's about planning for winter, about cutting enough hay, about settling with your neighbor instead of fighting him. The Graggas may not thrill readers the way the Njal saga does, but it offers a deeper insight into the mechanics of life, how people really lived, how they thought about fairness, how they tried to preserve peace. Second, we see how law is not just a set of rules, but a reflection of what a society values. Icelanders valued independence, memory, survival, and honor. Their laws were not imposed from above but grown from within. They reflect a society trying to navigate hardship without losing its sense of fairness and mutual responsibility. Finally, these laws remind us how fragile social systems can be. When memory fades, when the law is no longer shared, when authority shifts from community to crown, things change not always for the worse, but always profoundly. The Gragas could not stop the tide of royal governance or the influence of the church, but it preserved, for a time, a vision of law as shared knowledge, deeply embedded in the rhythms of land and life. We may no longer resolve disputes by walking the boundary stones or describing a horse's markings aloud before witnesses, but in a deeper sense, we are still negotiating how to live together. We are still stacking hay before winter, in whatever form our winters take, and we are still trying, in our own way, to balance individual need against communal good. In the end, perhaps the dullness of these laws is what makes them so powerful. They remind us that history is not always shaped by kings and conquests. Sometimes, it is shaped by farmers arguing about grass. Story 2, The Althing, where every dispute became an endless saga. You wake up beside a cold stream. The sky above is overcast, and the land around you is a wide plain scattered with low tents and turf walls. Voices murmur in the distance. A man hammers a wooden stake into the ground. Another tends a cookfire. A woman stoops to wash clothes in the river. You are in Thingvellir, the Thing Fields, in southern Iceland, around the 11th century at the site of the Althing, the great general assembly of Iceland. Every year during the short Icelandic summer, people from across the island would travel to this spot. Some came on horseback, others on foot. It might take days to reach it, crossing rivers and rocky valleys. They came to resolve disputes, recite law, make alliances, and sometimes to simply be seen. The Althing was not a parliament in the modern sense, nor a court as we might understand it. It was something in between a gathering of chieftains and commoners, lawsuits and trade stalls, family reunions and political theater. And at the center of it all, sometimes quite literally, were the disputes, long, tedious, and bitter disputes. The Althing was established around 930 CE, and for over 3 centuries it was the primary site of Icelandic law and justice. Unlike other medieval societies ruled by monarchs or bishops, Iceland's governance was uniquely decentralized. There was no king, no police force, no prison system. Justice was carried out by agreement and obligation, through memory and public performance. Disputes might concern land boundaries, inheritance, damage to property, or physical injury. A man could bring a case if someone's cow trampled his fence, if hay was stolen, or if an insult was spoken too loudly. Each case could become a kind of performance, with witnesses reciting details remembered from years ago, and opposing parties interpreting the same facts in contradictory ways. And though it may sound like chaos, the Althing followed a remarkably rigid structure. The law dictated the size of fines, the steps required to bring a case, and the order in which it should be heard. But that didn't make it efficient. In fact, quite the opposite. A case might drag on for years, appearing again and again at successive things local, regional, and then at the Althing itself each time with new testimony, more arguments, or fresh witnesses who'd only just come forward. One famous legal historian described medieval Icelandic law as a system that transformed every dispute into a saga. And that wasn't a metaphor. The sagas, the prose narratives for which Iceland is justly famous, are littered with legal cases, families feuding over land, friendships shattered by accusations, honor defended through formal complaint. In these stories, the law is not a background feature. It is the battleground. The Law Rock and the Law Speaker. At the center of the Althing stood the Lurgberg, the Law Rock. This was the platform from which the Lurgsargumather, or Law Speaker, would recite the laws aloud. He stood before the assembled free men and repeated from memory the legal codes that governed Iceland. Each year, he was required to speak 1/3 of the entire law, meaning the whole body of law was recited in full every 3 years. This practice was not ceremonial, it was essential. Before the Gragas law code was written down in the 13th century, All law existed as oral tradition. The law speaker's memory was the only official repository of the rules. If he forgot a clause or recited it incorrectly, the consequences could be enormous. It is difficult to imagine today the pressure that must have come with such a responsibility. A single misstatement could lead to a wrong judgment, a feud, even a killing. And yet the law speaker did not speak alone. He was surrounded by the Lurgrada, a council of chieftains and legal experts who helped shape rulings and approve new laws. Together, they were the closest thing Iceland had to a legislature and judiciary. Their debates were long and intricate. They parsed the fine details of past agreements. They cross-examined witnesses, analyzed the placement of property boundaries, and deliberated over the value of an insult. Because yes, even insults had legal value. Legal insults, legal fines. The law was remarkably specific about what could be said, when, and what it would cost. To call a man a coward ragger without proof, for example, was a serious offense. So too was accusing someone of practicing sorcery, committing adultery, or fathering a child out of wedlock. The law called these nith defamatory insults that threatened a man's honor. If proven, the speaker would be fined or worse, outlawed. Outlawry was not imprisonment. It was removal from society. A lesser outlaw might be banished for 3 years, forbidden to receive help from others. A full outlaw was declared Reitripor, rightfully killable. That is, anyone could kill the outlaw without punishment. Outlaws could not inherit property, enter legal contracts, or even be buried on Christian ground. In a land with no prisons, outlawry was the ultimate punishment, and it carried a heavy weight. It's easy to imagine how such a punishment could be abused, and yet the system worked slowly, laboriously, but with astonishing endurance. For over 300 years, the Althing functioned as a stabilizing force in Icelandic life. Not perfect, not impartial, but effective enough to prevent the island from descending into lawless chaos at least for a time. Commerce and camping. Not every dispute ended in blood or banishment. Most were petty and most were resolved peacefully, and the Althing was not only a place for lawsuits. It was also a market, a festival, and a gathering of far-flung kin. Farmers came with goods to trade wool, fish, fermented shark. Blacksmiths repaired tools. Children ran between tents and stories were exchanged beside fires. Some families made a tradition of setting up camp at the same spot every year. Over time, small turf huts or rock foundations were built and reused each summer. Archaeological remains of these dwellings can still be seen at Thingvellir. This was, in many ways, Iceland's only national gathering. If you wanted news, goods, or justice, this was where you came. But not everyone left satisfied. Cases could be left unresolved if key witnesses failed to appear. Feuding families might arrive armed despite laws forbidding weapons at the Althing. And though fights were rare, tensions ran high. Occasionally, settlements were forced, not agreed upon. And even when a dispute was legally resolved, personal resentment could linger, sometimes for years. In the sagas, we see time and again how legal decisions spark emotional reactions. A man is fined for a killing, but the victim's kin find the fine insultingly low. Another accepts compensation for an insult, only to be mocked for doing so. These tensions bubble beneath the legal proceedings. The Althing was not a utopia of reason. It was a living system, shaped by people with memories, egos, grudges, and survival instincts. An assembly without a king. One of the most remarkable things about the Althing was that it existed without a monarch. In most of medieval Europe, disputes were resolved in royal courts. Justice flowed from kings and bishops, but Iceland had none. It had chieftains Gathar, each controlling a local thing and each responsible for bringing disputes to the larger Althing. These chieftains were not nobles by blood, but landowners with legal and political influence. Their authority depended not on violence, but on support from their followers. This decentralized structure gave ordinary people surprising access to the legal process. A farmer with a dispute could appeal to his local chieftain, gather witnesses, and present a case at the Althing. It was not always fair. Wealth and status still mattered, but it was more participatory than many contemporary systems. Still, the lack of a central executive power meant that enforcement was uneven. Winning a case didn't mean your opponent paid the fine. There was no sheriff to seize property. Instead, enforcement fell to social pressure, family retaliation, or private negotiation. Over time, this led to instability. Powerful families used the law to escalate feuds rather than resolve them. And as the 13th century approached, the system began to strain under the weight of its own unresolved sagas. But what caused the final unraveling of this decentralized justice system? How did a people so invested in law, memory, and procedure come to abandon the all things independence and submit to foreign rule? Was it the natural consequence of feuding, or did outside influences erode the island's legal traditions from within? When we left the wide plains of Thingvellir, the Althing stood at the center of Icelandic law and society, equal parts marketplace, parliament, and courtroom. But the Althing, for all its symbolism and social function, had a central weakness. It relied on memory, community enforcement, and a delicate balance of power. As Iceland entered the turbulent 13th century, those balancing acts began to falter. What had once been a functional, if slow legal system started to fracture under its own weight. A society of many chiefs and no king. The Icelandic Commonwealth, unlike other European societies, operated without a monarchy. This sounds democratic, but it was far from egalitarian. The island was divided into Gothorth chieftaincies held by powerful families. These chieftains, or Gothar, were not hereditary nobles by legal definition, though in practice their power often remained within families. They held sway over their followers through negotiation, prestige, and wealth, not by divine right or royal appointment. A Gothi represented his people at the Althing. He could propose laws, support cases, or offer protection. In turn, his supporters backed him, gave him gifts, and relied on him for representation in legal and sometimes violent disputes. It was a reciprocal relationship, and it worked until it didn't. As Iceland's population grew and land grew scarce, conflicts intensified. More importantly, power began to concentrate. Wealthier families bought up multiple Gothorth, consolidating influence across vast regions. One man might represent several chieftaincies, increasing his sway at the Althing and beyond. The balance of influence that had once spread across dozens of regional leaders was shrinking. By the early 13th century, Iceland was effectively ruled by a handful of powerful clans. Most notable among them were the Sturlungar, a family that would give its name to an entire period of Icelandic civil conflict, the Sturlungaöld, or Age of the Sturlungs. The Sturlung era, civil war in a stateless land. The Sturlung era, c. 1220–1264, was a dark chapter in Icelandic history. It was a period marked by violence, shifting alliances, and breakdowns in the legal mechanisms that had once guided society. What began as legal disputes and power maneuvering among chieftains quickly escalated into armed conflict. The sagas that document this period, particularly the Sturlunga saga, read like legal thrillers with a body count. Disputes over inheritance turned into battles. Alliances were forged and broken at the Althing. Entire regions were raided. The mechanisms of law meant to resolve conflict were instead being used to justify feuds and violence. At the heart of the chaos was a contradiction. Icelanders deeply believed in law but had no central power to enforce it. If a case was decided at the Althing and the losing party refused to comply, what could be done? The only real recourse was social pressure, or violence. And as social trust broke down, so too did the authority of the law. By the mid-13th century, Iceland had become a patchwork of semi-private armies, regional warlords, and broken legal institutions. People still traveled to Thingvellir, still listened to the lawspeaker, still brought cases, but the decisions carried less weight. What good was a legal judgment when you knew your opponent had more men and better weapons? The church and the crown, foreign influences rising. As Iceland's internal structures faltered, external forces loomed. The Christian Church, which had gained a foothold in Iceland during the 11th century, had grown in influence. Bishops now wielded significant legal power, particularly in matters of morality, marriage, and inheritance. Church law, canon law began to influence secular decisions. This shift brought both structure and complexity. Canon law was written, interpreted by educated clergy, and enforced through ecclesiastical courts. It didn't rely on memory or community consensus. It relied on hierarchy. For a decentralized society like Iceland, this was a major cultural change. The bishoprics at Skálholt and Haller became powerful players in both politics and law. They could excommunicate offenders, a punishment that had both spiritual and social consequences. In some cases, they could even override decisions made at the Althing. Slowly, legal authority was being pulled away from the plains of Thingvellir and into church halls and episcopal courts. At the same time, the Norwegian crown was watching closely. Iceland had always been culturally tied to Norway. Many Icelandic families traced their ancestry to Norwegian settlers, and trade routes had long connected the island to the mainland. But in the 13th century, the Norwegian kings began to assert political influence. They saw Iceland's fractured governance as both a threat and an opportunity. King Håkon IV of Norway, known as Håkon the Old, began offering patronage to Icelandic chieftains. Some accepted, seeing in royal backing a way to gain an edge over rivals. Others resisted, seeing foreign rule as a betrayal of Icelandic independence. But as the civil wars dragged on, more and more leaders began to see the crown not as an invader, but as a stabilizer. After all, what good was independence if it led to endless bloodshed? The Old Covenant and the end of the Free State. By 1262, the balance had tipped. A group of Icelandic chieftains signed the Gamli Sáttmáli, the Old Covenant, formally submitting to the authority of the Norwegian king. In exchange, they were promised peace, trade, and legal reform. The Althing would remain, but it would now operate under royal oversight. It was a moment of quiet surrender, not dramatic conquest. No foreign army landed. No battles were fought for control of Thingvellir. Icelanders gave up their independence through negotiation, not subjugation. Some likely saw it as a relief, a way to finally restore order. Others saw it as the loss of something deeply Icelandic, a society governed by memory, consensus, and local power. In the years that followed, royal law codes replaced the Gragas. First came the Jarnsitha, Iron Side, in 1271, and later the Jonsbok in 1281, which remained the foundation of Icelandic law for centuries. These new codes were written, centralized, and influenced by both church and crown. They were more predictable, more enforceable, but also more distant. The Althing continued to meet. The Lögberg still stood, but the character of the gathering had changed. It was no longer the heart of Icelandic justice, but a branch office of the Norwegian legal system. What was lost? In giving up their independence, Icelanders gained legal stability. The feuds that had racked the island began to subside. Trade with Norway increased. Ecclesiastical courts brought moral and social order, at least on paper. But something was lost too. The Althing, as it had existed, was not efficient. It was not impartial, but it was uniquely Icelandic. It emerged from the needs of a scattered, kin-based society living in a harsh environment. It was born of cooperation and constant negotiation. It reflected a worldview in which law was not distant but lived. Every dispute was personal, yet managed through public channels. Every insult could become a court case. Every horse, fence, and insult had legal weight. Icelanders were, as historian Jesse Byock once wrote, a people who sued each other to death. But in doing so, they kept civil war at bay for centuries. When law failed and violence took its place, the people turned outward. They sought structure and found it in a foreign king. But the story of the Althing reminds us that law, at its best, is more than rules. It is a process of belonging, a way to resolve our endless sagas without falling into blood and exile. But did the memory of the Free State fade entirely? Did the Icelanders, once brought under foreign rule, abandon the habits of self-governance? Or did the echoes of the old Althing linger, quietly shaping Iceland's future long after the kings of Norway had gone? By 1262, the Icelandic Commonwealth had ended, and the island had passed peacefully, though not without contention, under the rule of the Norwegian crown. The Althing continued to meet, its symbolic value preserved, but it was no longer the supreme body it once had been. Yet, history rarely folds neatly at the end of a chapter. What followed was not a clean break, but a long echo, a quiet continuation of legal customs, memory, and political self-definition that would subtly shape Iceland's identity for centuries to come. The law remains. Even under Norwegian rule, Icelanders did not simply discard their legal traditions. The Gragas, while formally replaced, lingered in memory and in formal practice. Farmers, chieftains turned officials, and even clergy continued to refer to its principles when dealing with local matters, especially in rural areas where royal influence was weak. The Jonsbok, the royal law code introduced in 1281, was comprehensive and written, unlike the oral Gragas, but it still included many provisions adapted from earlier Icelandic practice. Property law, local assemblies, things, and customary fines were retained, if reorganized under the new legal structure. In many respects, the new system was an evolution, not a destruction of the old. But the nature of authority had shifted. Law was no longer recited at the Lurgberg, but read from manuscripts. It no longer relied on communal consensus, but on the authority of royal delegates and ecclesiastical courts. It was no longer Icelandic law, it was Norwegian law applied in Iceland. Still, the cultural memory of the Althing as the center of justice persisted. The site at Thingvellir continued to host assemblies. While no longer autonomous, these gatherings remained a national ritual. The landscape itself held meaning. The cliffs, the plains, the echoing voices around the Law Rock, these were not easily erased by a change of sovereign. The Althing under foreign rule. Throughout the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the Althing functioned as a legal administrative body under first the Norwegian, then Danish crown. Its political power was limited, but it retained authority over certain local matters, and its meeting at Thingvellir became an enduring national tradition. The position of lawspeaker became ceremonial, though still held social prestige. The monarchy issued laws through royal officials. By the 17th century, absolute monarchy had arrived in Denmark, and Iceland was fully integrated into the Danish state. The Althing's remaining functions were gradually eroded, and in 1800 it was formally dissolved by royal decree. But again, even this end was not the end. Icelanders never forgot their unique history of governance. The idea of a self-governing assembly, built from oral law and social memory, remained a source of cultural pride. Icelandic writers, poets, and nationalists in the 19th century would invoke the Althing not just as a historical curiosity, but as a symbol of what Iceland had once been and what it might be again. Revival and national identity. In the 19th century, amid the rise of nationalism across Europe, Iceland began to imagine independence. Danish rule was, by this time, deeply entrenched, but Icelanders, many of them educated in Denmark itself, began to look inward, to their history, language, and law. At the heart of this cultural revival was the memory of the Althing. The old stories of Thingvellir, of chieftains reciting law and farmers arguing over fences and insults, took on new meaning. What had once been practical history became symbolic. Iceland had ruled itself before and might do so again. In 1843, the Danish king agreed to re-establish the Althing as a consultative assembly, meeting in Reykjavik rather than Thingvellir. Though initially limited in power, this new Althing was a clear nod to the island's past. Over the next century, Iceland moved gradually toward autonomy, first gaining home rule in 1904, then full independence from Denmark in 1944, during the chaos of World War II. On June 17, 1944, Icelanders gathered at Thingvellir to declare the founding of the Republic of Iceland. It was no coincidence that they chose the site of the old Althing. Here, on the same plains where law had once been spoken aloud from memory, the modern Icelandic nation was reborn. The president took his oath of office at the Lurgberg, the Law Rock. The echoes of the past were not lost on those in attendance. In many ways, the medieval Althing, with all its imperfections and eccentricities, had become a founding myth for modern Iceland. The landscape of law. What remains today of the original Althing is not merely the institution, though that too endures in a modern form, but the landscape of law. Thingvellir is now a national park, and also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors walk among the remains of booths where families once camped, beside cliffs that formed the backdrop to legal debate. The Law Rock still stands. It does not echo with the voices of law speakers anymore, but with tourists and schoolchildren, visiting the place where Iceland once governed itself with nothing more than memory, reputation, and a sharp awareness of the dangers of disunity. This landscape teaches us something, not just about Iceland, but about the nature of law itself. Law in the Icelandic tradition was never just a written text. It was something performed, witnessed, remembered. It was not the property of the elite, but a collective framework shaped by necessity, rooted in land and survival, and refined through constant argument. The people who built the Althing did so not out of idealism, but because they had to. In the absence of a king, they found another way to live together. That method wasn't perfect. It frayed and eventually failed. But for over 300 years, it held a stateless society at the edge of the world, resolving disputes without armies, without prisons, without palaces. Just men and women, memory and law. Reflection: what makes a dispute endless? We titled this story Where Every Dispute Became an Endless Saga. And truly, that was both the flaw and the beauty of the Icelandic system. It took an incredibly long time to resolve conflict, but it also ensured that every dispute mattered. Nothing was too small to be heard, no insult too minor to be weighed, no boundary too remote to deserve attention. Today, we might value efficiency in our legal systems, but in medieval Iceland, process was power. Everyone knew the rules, or at least enough of them to participate. And while violence did erupt, it was delayed, debated, and in most cases contained by law. Perhaps then, the slowness was the point. Modern nations are often built on revolutions, wars, declarations. Iceland's foundation in both the medieval and modern periods was built instead on law. Law as memory, law as community, law as the space between survival and collapse. And as you sit quietly now, perhaps imagining the mist over the fields at Thingvellir, you might ask, is it better to settle things quickly, or to let them play out again and again, until everyone is heard, even if the saga never truly ends? Story 3: Measuring Meadows, Land Division and Boundary Stones. You walk out onto a mist-covered meadow in early summer. The grass is tall, dotted with small yellow flowers. Somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgles beneath a rock ledge. You might think it's just land open and shared. But in medieval Iceland, every inch of this quiet pasture might belong to someone. And knowing exactly where one man's field ended and another's began could mean the difference between peace and feud, between subsistence and starvation. This is the story of measuring meadows, of stones placed as silent sentinels across the land, of disputes that began not with a sword but with a step in the wrong direction. It is the story of how Icelanders marked their world not with walls or roads, but with memory, cairns, and the slow ritual of agreement. The importance of land in a sparse world. In medieval Iceland, land was life, but not all land was equal. Much of the island was uninhabitable lava fields, glaciers, mountains. Usable land was mostly concentrated along the coasts and valleys, patches of pasture, hay meadows, and cropland that sustained livestock and, by extension, families. Unlike in many parts of Europe, there were no feudal lords with vast estates. Land ownership in Iceland was distributed more widely, and much of the land was held by independent farmers. Some families were wealthy, with multiple homesteads and expansive grazing rights. Others worked marginal plots, surviving on the edge. The Græðgi Iceland's medieval law code dedicated extensive attention to how land was divided, measured, claimed, and contested. Boundary stones, landamerkjastinar, were key. These were carefully placed rocks, often naturally shaped or intentionally modified, set along agreed-upon lines between properties. Their purpose was simple: to mark where one person's rights ended and another's began. But these markers weren't just physical objects. They were legal statements, backed by witnesses and memory. In a society without cadastral maps, surveys, or printed deeds, the act of placing a stone was ceremonial. It required the presence of others, who would later testify to the stone's position and meaning. A misplaced or moved stone could start a legal case. A disputed boundary could consume families for generations. Placing the stones. The process of establishing a boundary was methodical. First, a landholder, often a new settler or a man who had acquired a neighboring plot, would walk the intended boundary with witnesses. They would mark key points with stones or natural landmarks: a boulder, a stream bend, a ridge. Each point had to be memorable and visible. Stones were sometimes carved with crosses or runic marks. The goal was permanence, but permanence in a volatile land was difficult. Frost heaves, landslides, floods, or even livestock could displace the stones, and some were simply moved by human hands. Once the boundary was marked, it had to be declared publicly. This was often done at a local thing, the regional assembly. The landholder would announce the placement of the stones and call upon witnesses. This public aspect was crucial. If a dispute arose later, the testimony of those witnesses could protect the original boundary so long as they remembered it clearly. Memory in this system was not casual. It was cultivated. Men who had witnessed the placing of stones might rehearse those positions mentally for years, knowing they could be called upon in a future dispute. To forget was to weaken a claim. The role of the witnesses. The law required at least 3 adult male witnesses for a proper land claim. They had to be free men. Slaves and thralls were not permitted to serve as witnesses in such matters. Ideally, the witnesses were from the local community, well respected and known to both parties. This witness system was Iceland's version of documentation. There were no title deeds or registries, no centralized record of ownership. Instead, there was community memory, and that memory could be remarkably durable. Some sagas describe legal disputes where an elderly man is brought to testify about a boundary stone placed in his youth. He walks the line slowly, describing each point, recalling the shapes of stones, the flow of streams, the sounds of birds that nested nearby. His memory becomes the map. But memory could be challenged. If 2 witnesses remembered differently, or if witnesses had died, moved away, or been discredited, the case could falter. Sometimes entire legal proceedings turned on whether one stone had been always there, or only recently moved. And yes, people did move them. When stones move, boundary stones were tempting targets in an otherwise peaceful feud. To shift one just a few feet could mean access to a better pasture or stream. The change might not be noticed for weeks, especially in remote regions. But when it was, the consequences could be explosive. The Græðgi established penalties for moving stones. It was considered a form of property theft and deceit. If a man was found to have altered a boundary without public declaration or agreement, he could be fined or, in serious cases, declared an outlaw. The law recognized that without respect for boundaries, the fragile social fabric would begin to fray. But proving movement was difficult. You had to show that a stone had been moved and who had done it. This meant calling witnesses, retracing steps, presenting historical memory like evidence in a court. Some cases became mini sagas of their own, with farmers bringing forth 3 or 4 generations of testimony to prove the original placement. And still, sometimes, the truth remained buried along with the old stone, now pushed into a gully or replaced by another. The quiet tensions of land use. Even when boundaries were clear, tension remained. Icelandic land use often involved shared resources, grazing fields, rivers, driftwood beaches. A man might own a hayfield bordered by another man's pasture. If sheep wandered into the hayfield, or if hay cutting began a day too early, a legal complaint could arise. Thus, boundary stones were not just spatial markers, they were temporal ones too. They told you where you could go and when. Laws governed when you could cut hay, when animals could graze, and when rights reverted to communal use. These seasonal patterns required cooperation and memory just as much as land ownership did. In this way, the stones became part of a living calendar. They were points around which time and labor turned. And for those with little land or marginal land, the stones represented both protection and limitation. You could not graze your sheep beyond the line. You could not cut grass in the neighbor's field, even if it lay fallow. The boundary was absolute, even if it seemed arbitrary. It's easy to imagine the resentment that built around these stones, especially in hard years, when a few feet of grass could mean the survival of a flock. Land as legacy. Because land was so central, inheritance laws were tightly connected to boundaries. When a man died, his property had to be divided among heirs according to complex rules. Sons, daughters, and even more distant kin might have claims, and each claim needed to be mapped out. Boundary stones again became essential. Families would walk the edges, recalling which parcels belonged to which ancestor, where stones had been placed decades ago, and who had witnessed them. These inheritance walks, called landabrafsganga, were both legal and ritualistic. The problem, of course, was that over time, division created fragmentation. A farm divided among 4 sons might still be large enough to function, but when that land was divided again and again, the boundaries grew more tangled. Stones multiplied, claims overlapped, confusion deepened. In some cases, disputes were so complex that entire properties were effectively frozen too legally risky to farm or trade. And so, some stones stood not as clear boundaries, but as reminders of a system overwhelmed by its own commitment to fairness. But was this complexity unique to Iceland? Or did it reflect something universal about how we measure, divide, and remember land? And how did this granular system of stone markers evolve, or survive, when written deeds, central government, and colonial legal concepts arrived centuries later? We left the Icelandic farmers standing beside their stones, clutching memories like maps. These seemingly dull markers, boundary stones, define not only land, but also memory, community, survival, and eventually, conflict. Now, let us walk further into the intricacies of this land-measuring world. We'll follow inheritance cases, explore overlapping claims, and witness how geography shaped law literally. The geography of dispute. Iceland's terrain posed unique problems for boundary making. Its volcanic origins created a patchwork of lava fields, rivers that shifted course, and weather-worn landscapes. What might have been a useful marker in one season, a large rock or a stream bend, could vanish or change in the next. Avalanches buried stones. Rivers flooded their banks. Frost lifted cairns and sent them tumbling down hillsides. The law, of course, tried to keep up. If a marker was lost due to natural causes, the law allowed for the boundary to be re-established through witness testimony. But again, this required memory people who had seen the land before the change and who could vouch for the old layout. In one notable case recorded in a saga, a lava flow had covered a field boundary, destroying all visible stones. The dispute between two neighbors that followed lasted more than 10 years. Neither party could agree on the original line, and multiple witnesses gave conflicting statements. Eventually, the matter was decided not by a clear boundary, but by negotiation, a recognition that the land itself had changed too much to permit certainty. Geography, then, was not merely a backdrop to legal life. It was an active participant. The land moved, shifted, eroded, and demanded that the law respond in kind. Inheritance, division by stone. One of the most common causes of boundary disputes was inheritance. When a landowner died, his property had to be divided among eligible heirs. But unlike a system based on a single heir receiving an entire estate, Icelandic law allowed, and sometimes required, division among multiple children, or even extended kin. This meant that a single homestead could, over time, be divided into multiple parts, sometimes with different owners living on the same land, each with a partial claim to the fields, pastures, and even outbuildings. In such cases, stones multiplied. A hayfield once belonging to a single man might now be shared among 4 brothers, each with a different share, marked by new boundary lines etched into the same field. These stones were not just visual markers. They often carried legal inscriptions, carved runes, or simple crosses, placed there as both testimony and warning. Some were buried halfway in the soil to prevent them being moved. Others were recorded in oral testimony during inheritance walks, which could last days. Witnesses again played a crucial role. In the absence of written wills, the spoken record became binding. The law provided frameworks for these divisions, outlining what share a daughter could receive if she married, or how illegitimate children were to be handled. But the boundary stones told the final tale, where the land ended where it began, and who had the right to walk its edge. Yet division also bred complexity. Over time, the constant splitting and overlapping of claims created a landscape of tangled ownership. Even minor errors in memory, misremembered placements, lost witnesses could escalate into years of litigation. The role of arbitration and compromise. The Icelanders were a litigious people, not in the sense of endless modern bureaucracy, but in their tendency to treat every dispute as worthy of formal resolution. But they were also, by necessity, negotiators. A society without a central enforcement authority required people to come to terms, even when the law was unclear. The law provided mechanisms for arbitration, jurth. This was especially useful in land disputes, where the goal was not always to determine absolute ownership, but to preserve neighborly relations and ensure continued survival. After all, a field might be yours on paper, or rather, in memory, but it wouldn't grow grass if your neighbor poisoned your well or let his sheep trample your crops out of spite. In arbitration, a neutral party, often a respected elder or a minor chieftain, would walk the disputed land with both sides. He would listen to arguments, call witnesses, and propose a solution. This might involve compensation in silver, a rearrangement of the boundary stones, or shared use rights for a period of time. The key was consensus, not punishment. One common compromise involved floating boundaries, seasonal adjustments based on practical needs. For instance, if a man's grazing land was hit by early frost, a neighbor might allow temporary access to part of his field in exchange for labor or goods. These arrangements were not part of the gragaas, but they were respected locally and sometimes even cited in later legal proceedings. Through these slow, community-centered mechanisms, land disputes were often resolved with minimal violence, but not always. When stones turned to blood. Despite the law's intention to prevent violence, land could provoke bloodshed. In a world where survival depended on a few usable acres, even minor disagreements could escalate. The sagas record dozens of feuds sparked by grazing rights, trespassing, and disputed boundary lines. One particularly well-known story involves a dispute over a narrow pasture between two families. What began as a disagreement over sheep grazing turned into a full-blown feud after one family accused the other of moving a boundary stone during the night. Accusations of dishonor were exchanged. Fines were offered and refused. Eventually, the matter ended in violence, with multiple killings and decades of bitterness. These stories may seem dramatic, but they illustrate something very real about medieval Icelandic life. Boundaries were not just physical, they were moral. To move a stone was not simply theft, it was a breach of the social contract, an attack on honor, and an act of deliberate deception. The law tried to contain such outbreaks. It assigned precise fines for trespassing, stone moving, and even for making false accusations about boundary claims. But again, enforcement depended on community will. If both parties refused to submit, or if the wider network of neighbors took sides, the system failed. Feuds erupted. The line between law and vengeance blurred. Boundary stones in cultural memory. Even after written law replaced oral tradition, the culture of boundary stones persisted. In rural Iceland, well into the 19th century, people still walked their boundaries annually, reaffirming memory and ensuring that markers remained in place. Children were taught the names and shapes of key stones. They were taken on inheritance walks, shown where their grandfather had claimed land, told stories of disputes and reconciliations. Stones became more than property markers, they became genealogical waypoints. A boundary stone told not just of land, but of lineage. The Icelandic sagas preserve this sensibility. They describe the land with exacting detail. East to the rock shaped like a ram's horn, then north to the birch tree beside the cold spring. These details weren't literary embellishments, they were legal landmarks. Anyone reading or hearing the saga could picture the land, walk it in their mind, argue it in court if needed. In a way, the entire Icelandic landscape became a kind of remembered document marked not with ink, but with stones, streams, and stories. But what happened when modernization arrived, when maps replaced memory, and stones gave way to surveys and fences? How did Iceland adapt its deeply personal, memory-bound system to the impersonal precision of modern law? The path we've walked so far has taken us through meadows thick with memory stones that marked not just land, but life. In this final section, we arrive at the slow transformation of Icelandic land law from oral tradition to state-managed documentation. We explore how ancient practices collided with modern legal systems, and how boundary stones, though mostly silent now, still whisper under the soil. From stones to surveys, the rise of written records. In the early modern period, Iceland began to undergo a slow but steady legal transformation. The reintroduction of written law, the arrival of royal administrative systems, and the growing influence of foreign models, especially Danish and later continental European legal thinking, began to displace the stone and memory model that had defined Icelandic land management for centuries. This was not an overnight change. Even as early as the 18th century, many rural communities still relied on oral descriptions of boundaries, sometimes recited from memory or passed down in poetic verse. But increasingly, landowners were encouraged or required to register their land holdings in writing. Maps were drawn, surveys conducted. Legal cases required documents, not just testimony. These changes introduced new challenges. Paper records could contradict remembered boundaries. Surveyors unfamiliar with local customs might draw lines through shared pastures or ignore informal usage rights. Legal disputes that once turned on witness recollection now turned on conflicting interpretations of poorly drawn maps. And yet, despite the disruption, many of the old practices persisted in rural Iceland. Some families, rather than abandon their stone markers, simply added them to written descriptions. Inheritance documents from the 19th century often include lines such as, from the large moss-covered rock known as Lambistane, eastward to the stream known as Frosta. These were not scientific measurements, they were human ones. The land still had a voice. Land consolidation and the disappearance of the smallholder. As modernization continued into the 19th and 20th centuries, another change altered Iceland's relationship with the land: consolidation. Population shifts, economic hardship, and changing agricultural practices led to the abandonment of many smaller farms, especially in remote areas. Land was absorbed into larger holdings. In many places, boundary stones were left to fall, unattended. This wasn't just a legal change, it was a cultural one. The relationship between family and farm, which had once defined identity, became looser. Younger generations moved to towns and cities. Fewer people knew the names of the stones, the old lines of inheritance, the shape of forgotten fields. Some of the most remote farms were never formally surveyed. Their boundaries remained in oral tradition until well into the 20th century. In legal disputes, courts occasionally accepted elderly testimony about long-lost stones and customary usage, but these exceptions grew rarer. Gradually, Iceland's legal landscape became aligned with the rest of Europe, documented, standardized, impersonal. And yet the land remembered. Archaeology and rediscovery. In recent decades, archaeologists and historians have turned their attention to Iceland's legal landscape literally. Using satellite imagery, aerial photography, and on-the-ground surveys, they've identified hundreds of surviving boundary stones. Many of them are now unmarked, lichen-covered, or half-buried, but they still follow ancient paths: ridgelines, streambeds, stone walls. In some places, these discoveries have sparked community interest. Local schools have organized walking tour of ancient property lines. Oral histories are being collected. Older farmers, often the last generation to know these landscapes by memory, are recording the stories behind each stone. One such initiative in northern Iceland uncovered a full network of medieval field markers, which lined up precisely with descriptions from a 14th century saga. The stones had been ignored for centuries, but they had not been erased. They endured, patient as the land itself. Memory, law, and the meaning of boundaries. What does all this tell us? Why does it matter that a boundary stone remains in a forgotten field, or that an old man remembers where his grandfather cut hay? Because boundaries are never just about land. They are about belonging, responsibility, and history. In Iceland, the system of land division was not designed to maximize yield or enforce hierarchy. It was meant to balance survival with fairness. Stones were not just legal artifacts, they were social tools, reminders of agreements made and remembered. Modern legal systems often strive for clarity: a line on a map, a number in a deed, a measurement in meters. But in doing so, they lose something: the living relationship between people and place. The Icelandic model, for all its flaws and inefficiencies, preserved this connection. The law was not imposed on the land, it grew out of it. This is perhaps why the Icelandic sagas spend so much time describing meadows and stones and streams. To the medieval Icelander, the land was not just setting, it was character. Every rock had a name, every boundary a story, every dispute a lineage. And it's worth asking, what happens when we lose those names? Reflection: the silent stones. Today, a visitor walking through an Icelandic valley might pass by a weathered stone half buried in grass. There is no sign, no plaque, but it might once have marked the edge of a family's world. To us, it may seem insignificant, just another rock among thousands, but to those who lived here centuries ago, it was sacred. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense of order. This stone said, "Here begins your neighbor's right." It was not a wall, it was a handshake in stone form. In an age of digital records, satellite maps, and automated land registries, it can be difficult to understand how deeply law was once embedded in memory. But Iceland's boundary stones remind us. Law was once walked, once spoken, once felt beneath the hands of people who knew its meaning. Perhaps there is a lesson in that still. We live in a world that values speed and precision, but sometimes what matters more is memory, continuity, and the quiet acknowledgement of shared space. We all draw lines between what is ours and what is not, but do we remember why we draw them? And who else has walked there before? Story 4. The Price of a Cow. Livestock as Currency in Iceland. Picture a medieval Icelandic farm in the late 11th century. A low, turf-walled house sits nestled against a hill, the sod roof blending into the landscape. Smoke curls lazily from a chimney hole. Outside, a small herd of cattle grazes in a stony pasture, chewing rhythmically in the cool, damp air. There is no money here. No silver coins pass between hands, yet trade, debt, and wealth are very real. Because here a cow is worth more than coin. In Iceland's economy of necessity, livestock was currency. This is not metaphor. The Grágás, Iceland's medieval law code, measured nearly all values fines, rents, dowries, and debts in livestock, primarily cattle, sometimes sheep. The worth of a man's land was measured in the number of cows it could support through winter. The price of a marriage, a boat, or a legal settlement was set in head of cattle. This was an economy shaped not by coinage, but by creatures, warm, breathing animals whose bodies were both sustenance and store of value. In a land without cities, where imported goods were rare and coinage limited, livestock made sense. Cows were mobile, tangible, divisible through trade, and crucially alive. They reproduced. They grazed on free pasture. They provided milk, meat, hides, bones, and labor. They were, in the most literal sense, walking wealth. And like all currency, they had to be counted, valued, and protected. Livestock as legal tender. In Grágás, the term used for the value of a cow was the éirir, a unit of weight originally referring to silver, but later mapped onto livestock. One cow was generally equated to 6 ounces of silver, or 1 éirir. But the law did not measure debts in silver. It measured them in cattle, or in equivalent value in sheep or goats depending on availability. Fines especially were almost always paid in livestock. If a man insulted another with a nith, a defamatory insult, he might owe a cow. If a neighbor's bull broke through a fence and trampled hay, the damage was assessed not in abstract sums, but in actual animals. The injured party might take one or more from the offender's herd. This method ensured that value was both meaningful and immediate. A cow wasn't symbolic, it fed your family. One of the most carefully calibrated systems was the wergild, the man price owed as compensation for killing someone. Even in cases of murder, justice often took the form of a fixed number of cows. Depending on the social status of the victim, the killer might owe 12, 24, or even more. And while silver was occasionally accepted, especially later, as trade increased, livestock remained the default payment. But this raised a crucial question: what counted as a legal cow? Not all cows are equal. The law was not vague about the kind of cattle that counted toward fines or payments. The Grágás specifies that a valid cow for compensation must be in good health, of proper age, and of acceptable size. Sick or aged cows, calves too young to stand on their own, or cows nearing death were explicitly forbidden as legal tender. If someone attempted to pay a fine in substandard livestock, the payment could be rejected and additional penalties imposed. This introduced an early form of quality control. It wasn't enough to simply have cattle, you had to manage them well. Reputation as a herder became economically and legally important. If you were known to pass off sick animals in trades or settlements, you might find your future payments more heavily scrutinized or rejected entirely. Moreover, the season mattered. A cow in spring fat and producing milk was more valuable than a thin, overwintered cow in late winter. Debts were often timed to coincide with the post-calving season, when herds were healthiest and most numerous. Timing payments around the breeding and milking cycles of cows introduced a rhythm to economic life that followed the rhythms of the herd. Barter in a closed economy. Though cattle were the legal standard, Iceland's economy was largely barter-based. A boat might be traded for 6 cows. a set of forged iron tools for 1 cow and 4 sheep. Cheese, butter, wool, and hides all functioned as supplemental currencies, each measured in value relative to livestock. But this barter economy came with complications. What if a man didn't have cows but owed them? In such cases, the law allowed for substitutions. Sheep could be paid in lieu of a cow at a fixed ratio, usually 6 to 1. Goats, though less valuable, might be accepted in emergency situations. Even dried fish or homespun wool could sometimes substitute for a fraction of livestock value. But such exchanges often required negotiation. What if one man's sheep were scrawny? What if another insisted that only cows would settle the matter? Legal cases often involved not just how many animals were owed, but which ones, when, and under what conditions. Thus, lawyers in medieval Iceland didn't argue over decimal points, they argued over udders and hooves. In this way, law and livestock were deeply entangled. And because of this, theft wasn't just a criminal act, it was an assault on someone's wealth, standing, and legal capacity. Theft in the cow as capital. Cattle theft, unsurprisingly, was a serious crime. The law devoted long sections to its definition, investigation, and punishment. A man who stole another's cow could be forced to repay multiple times the animal's value, and in some cases, be outlawed. The law also accounted for intent. Stealing a cow and hiding it was treated more severely than taking it in the open. Killing a stolen cow to avoid detection was even worse. And because livestock often grazed freely in remote highland pastures, accusations of theft were not uncommon and not always easy to prove. As a result, herding practices began to include informal branding. While not branded with fire in the way of later European ranching cultures, Icelandic farmers developed a rich vocabulary of animal descriptions, color patterns, horn shapes, hoof sizes. Laws even dictated how these features could be used to identify animals in court. A farmer might bring witnesses who could describe a missing cow in exacting detail. White spot on the left flank, broken right horn, brindled forelegs. These descriptions became legal evidence. The memory of a cow's body was as important as the cow itself. This body-based identification shows, again, how law in Iceland was a lived experience not written in ledgers, but in the flesh and shape of things. But what happened when foreign trade introduced silver coins, when wealth could be stored in chests rather than herds? Did cows continue to hold value, or did they eventually lose their place as currency? How did the growing influence of external markets reshape Iceland's creature-based economy? As Iceland's medieval economy evolved, the central role of livestock, particularly cows as currency, began to be tested by external influences and internal pressures. Trade, foreign contact, Christianity, and the slow emergence of coinage all challenged the cow's supremacy. But like so many parts of Icelandic tradition, the transition was slow, complex, and often incomplete. In this section, we'll explore how foreign trade reshaped economic value in Iceland, how religious institutions began to interact with livestock economies, and how the tension between cows and coin reveals a deeper story about cultural continuity, legal adaptation, and economic survival. When coin met cow, the first signs of currency. For much of Iceland's early history, coins were rare curiosities. While Scandinavian neighbors like Norway and Denmark had developed minting operations and circulated coins by the 11th century, Iceland lacked the mineral resources and urban density that usually fostered a coin economy. That doesn't mean silver was unknown. Precious metal did circulate, mostly in the form of hack silver cut or broken silver objects traded by weight or foreign coinage. But it was used for major purchases or high-status transactions. Everyday exchanges, fines, dowries, debt repayments continued to rely on livestock. It wasn't until increased contact with the Norwegian crown in the 12th and 13th centuries that coin began to play a more regular role. The influence of Christianity also helped. Churches accepted silver in tithes, and ecclesiastical records began to include monetary valuations alongside livestock ones. Still, resistance to currency remained strong. Icelanders viewed livestock not just as wealth, but as a functional form of wealth, something that produced milk, calves, and even social standing. A purse full of coins might be impressive, but a full barn was security. Moreover, legal tradition resisted abstraction. The Gragas and even later codes like the Jonsbok retained livestock as a unit of measurement long after silver coin became more accessible. In this way, Icelandic law enshrined the cow not just as a source of food, but as a symbol of fairness and equivalency. The Church and the Cow. The arrival of Christianity in the 11th century brought with it not only new theological ideas, but new economic institutions. Chief among these were tithes. Icelanders were now expected to donate 1/10 of their income to the church, a revolutionary concept in a livestock-based economy. But what was income in a land where coinage was minimal? The answer, again, was cows. Tithes were measured in livestock value. A wealthy farmer might owe 2 cows and several sheep to his local church each year. The church, in turn, accumulated herds and required labor to manage them. Monasteries and episcopal sees became landowners and livestock traders. In some ways, they functioned like powerful chieftains but with divine backing and centralized authority. This created tensions. Secular farmers were now competing with clerical institutions that had superior legal protections and access to imported goods. Church holdings were often exempt from certain taxes, and priests could demand better payment terms. Over time, complaints arose about the church's role in land consolidation, and wealth hoarding complaints echoed in many parts of Europe, but with a distinctly Icelandic flavor. The law codes reflect this tension. Special clauses were added to govern church property and to ensure tithes were paid in proper form. These laws, interestingly, still measured payments in livestock equivalents, even as the church increasingly preferred silver. In a sense, cows remained the bridge between tradition and transformation. Debts, dowries, and the livestock ledger. Beyond fines and tithes, the cow also played a role in private contracts. Marriage agreements, for instance, often involved substantial transfers of livestock between families. A dowry, heimanfylgja, might include several cows, and the groom's family might reciprocate with a bride price, munder, also denominated in cattle. These exchanges were not symbolic. The livestock was transferred, physically driven to a new pasture, integrated into the herd, or sometimes kept under joint care with detailed provisions about use and reproduction. The agreement might specify that the first calf of each dowry cow belonged to the wife's family, a built-in mechanism to ensure fairness and long-term value. If a marriage ended in divorce or death, livestock returned to the original family. But complications arose. What if a cow died in the meantime? What if it was sold, eaten, or stolen? Legal records contain countless cases where families argue over the fate of a particular dowry cow or its offspring. The law had to create formulas for substitution equivalent animals, or their value in alternate forms of livestock or goods. In one recorded dispute from the 13th century, a widow sued her late husband's brother over a single cow that had been part of her dowry 20 years earlier. The cow, long dead, had borne several calves. The woman argued she was entitled not only to the cow's replacement value, but also to compensation for the calves and their milk output. The case dragged on for 2 years and was only settled when both parties agreed to accept a shared grazing agreement and 2 sheep in compensation. Such cases show how livestock remained embedded in the emotional and economic life of medieval Iceland. It wasn't just wealth, it was inheritance, memory, obligation. Livestock trade in the outside world. Iceland's isolation limited its economy, but coastal trade existed, particularly with Norway and other parts of Scandinavia. Livestock could not be exported easily. Shipping a live cow across the North Atlantic was risky, costly, and rare. Instead, Icelanders exported goods derived from livestock: wool, butter, semur, cheese, hides, and meat. These products became a kind of indirect currency, and their value was still measured in cow equivalents. A barrel of butter might be worth 1.5 cows, a set of sheepskins, perhaps a third of a cow. These equivalencies allowed Icelanders to participate in foreign markets without abandoning their domestic system. Still, the influx of silver and goods from abroad, especially grain, timber, and metal, slowly shifted the balance. Farmers who became involved in trade began to accumulate wealth in coin, and by the late Middle Ages, some legal contracts explicitly allowed silver payments in place of livestock. But even then, the law often demanded that silver be valued according to its cattle equivalent. The cow remained the yardstick. This persistence of valuation echoes older societies' use of commodity money, where goods like grain or salt served as standards of value long after currency was introduced. Iceland, with its tight-knit, agrarian society and emphasis on oral memory, simply resisted the abstraction of coinage longer than most. The social meaning of the herd. Finally, it's worth considering the social value of livestock. In Iceland, cows were more than units of exchange, they were symbols of standing. A man's reputation rested on how many cattle he could winter successfully. The law even classified people by wealth in terms of cows: full farmers, partial landholders, tenants with livestock, and landless laborers. In many cases, your ability to participate in the thing, the local or national assembly, depended on your wealth, again measured in cattle. A man needed to own enough livestock to support himself through winter in order to vote or bring legal claims. This linked economic survival directly to legal agency. In essence, cows weren't just a medium of exchange, they were a passport to political participation. But as silver gained ground and towns slowly developed, how did Icelanders reconcile the shift? Did they leave behind the cow as currency, or did it linger on as a nostalgic standard in an increasingly modernizing world? As Iceland entered the early modern era, it began a slow transition away from a livestock-based economy toward a monetary and market-based system. Yet, the legacy of the cow as currency was not so easily erased. Even as silver and trade goods took on greater importance, the rhythms of livestock remained embedded in the cultural and legal fabric of the island. In this final section, we explore how the cow, once the beating heart of the Icelandic economy, faded from its central role not with a sudden shift, but through slow erosion. And yet, even now in the language, landscape, and law of Iceland, the echo of cattle as currency lingers on. The emergence of coined currency. By the 17th century, under Danish rule, Iceland began to see the more consistent use of minted coins in trade and taxation. The Danish crown introduced standardized currency for use in both internal commerce and foreign exchange. Market towns such as Reykjavik, Isafjörður, and Akureyri began to develop into centers where silver coins and imported goods could circulate more freely. Even so, livestock retained significant importance, especially in rural areas where barter remained dominant. In fact, for many Icelanders, silver served not as money in itself, but as a kind of placeholder for livestock. The legal codes of the time continued to convert fines and debts into livestock equivalents even when paid in coin. This shows the remarkable durability of cattle as a standard of value. Even when not physically exchanged, the idea of livestock continued to shape how Icelanders conceptualized worth. A cow was not just a thing, it was a unit of memory, a baseline for fairness. But as coinage took deeper root, a shift occurred. Instead of exchanging cows, people began to sell livestock for silver, and then use silver to settle debts or pay fines. The abstraction of value was finally taking hold. The bureaucratization of value. As Danish bureaucratic systems became more entrenched in the 18th century, new forms of legal record-keeping were introduced. Property contracts were written in formal Danish legal language. Taxation was assessed in monetary terms. Officials sent from Copenhagen often had little understanding or patience for livestock equivalents. This created a tension between Iceland's traditional rural legal culture and its new colonial administrative overlay. Legal disputes that had once been settled by walking a field and pointing at a cow were now argued through documents, seals, and Danish laws that knew nothing of winter fodder or herd survival. To ease the transition, Icelandic scribes often maintained both systems in parallel. A land deed might state the sale price in silver, but also note how many cows the land could carry through the winter. A debt agreement might be recorded in coins, but include a clause detailing how payment could be made in sheep, if the market permitted. This dual system continued well into the 19th century, particularly in remote areas. It wasn't just a matter of tradition, it was practical. In places with no banks, little cash, and long winters, a living animal still held more value than a silver coin sealed in a chest. Cows and colonial trade. Livestock also played a key role in Iceland's position within Danish-controlled trade. For centuries, Denmark imposed strict monopoly laws on Icelandic commerce. Farmers were required to sell their goods, primarily wool, fish, and animal products, to licensed Danish merchants. Prices were fixed, markets limited, and options few. This further encouraged the preservation of livestock as wealth. If Danish buyers offered poor rates for butter or wool, Icelanders might choose to store value in their animals, instead building herds that could survive lean years, or be traded locally at more favorable rates. This resistance, subtle but persistent, helped preserve the social and economic importance of the cow. Even when the law and state policy favored coins, Icelanders continued to organize their lives around the herd. Language as a record of value. Perhaps one of the clearest signs of the cow's enduring role is the Icelandic language itself. Even today, phrases in Icelandic reflect the historical use of livestock as currency. Expressions such as kugildi, literally, cow value, linger in legal and agricultural terminology. Traditionally, 1 kugildi represented the amount of land required to support a single cow through the winter, roughly 1 hectare of usable pasture, depending on the region. This term was used not only to describe land value, but social rank and economic power. A farmer who held 10 kugildi was understood to be wealthy and influential, regardless of whether he dealt in coin. This concept allowed Icelanders to compare property, wealth, and social position without needing abstract accounting. Other terms also persist. Fe, an Old Norse word that originally meant both money and cattle, is still used to mean wealth or capital in modern Icelandic. This linguistic duality, where wealth is inseparable from livestock, tells us how deeply the idea was rooted in the culture. Words outlive coin. The cow today, cultural memory and agricultural identity. Iceland is now a fully modern economy. The krona is the national currency. Credit cards are accepted nearly everywhere. Imports arrive by ship and plane, but cows remain. Icelandic cattle, still genetically unique after centuries of geographic isolation, are a symbol of continuity. Their milk becomes skyr, a thick cultured dairy product. Their meat is served in traditional stews, and their image appears in festivals, schoolbooks, and children's stories. Farming remains a small but vital part of Icelandic life. Livestock farmers still speak in terms of grazing value and kugildi, though the term is now more historical than practical. Some rural communities hold walking tour of old boundary lines, where children are taught how their great-grandparents counted cows instead of coins. And legal historians continue to study the intricate livestock clauses in the Greggas and Jonsbok, tracing the evolution of cattle-based value systems into modern property law. Reflection, the currency of necessity. So what does the story of Icelandic livestock tell us beyond the quiet beauty of green fields and grazing cows? It reminds us that money is not, at its core, just metal or paper or digital numbers. Money is trust. Money is survival. And in Iceland, for nearly 1,000 years, that trust and survival were embodied in animals, creatures that lived, breathed, gave birth, and occasionally wandered away. The law, in turn, adapted to this reality. It didn't abstract value until it had to. It didn't impose coinage on a people who didn't need it. Instead, it built a robust, complex, and yes, occasionally frustrating system around livestock. A system of trade, of marriage, of justice. It was a boring economy in the best sense. Steady, tangible, meaningful. Not speculative, not inflated, not detached from the land. And maybe that's worth remembering. As you think of modern wealth of savings accounts, credit scores, fluctuating currencies, you might also picture a quiet Icelandic field, a farmer counting cows, a neighbor watching just to be sure, a community remembering who owns what, not for profit but for fairness, for balance. For winter. Story 5, Seasonal Rhythms, how Icelanders stored hay for winter. You rise before the sun and step out into a chill morning fog. The air smells faintly of damp grass and old earth. Around you, the meadows are tall and green, not yet cut. It is late July in medieval Iceland, and you, like every other farmer on the island, are watching the weather, the grass, and the sky. The hay season has begun. To live in medieval Iceland was to live by rhythm. Not the rhythm of bells or markets or court sessions, but the rhythm of the land, the pulse of seasons, the turning of winds, the brief gift of summer. And no rhythm was more vital than that of the hay. For in Iceland, hay was not a crop, it was a clock. It measured your preparedness for winter, your wealth, your status, and even your morality. It was law and necessity, custom and labor, survival in green form. You did not just cut hay. You raced to gather enough of it before the cold came back. And failure meant hunger not only for you, but for your cows, your sheep, your children. This story is not about glory or war or grand discoveries. It is about hay, wet, heavy, slow to dry. It is about the people who cut it with iron scythes, who built hayricks and raked grass while the sun hovered low in the northern sky. And it is about the laws, customs, and survival strategies that developed around this most humble yet essential resource. Let us begin, then, in the meadow. The short, ruthless summer. In Iceland, the usable hay season was short, often no more than 6 weeks from late June to early August. In this time, every available able-bodied person worked in the fields. Children raked, women stacked, men cut. Even the elderly helped gather or dried the tools between uses. It was a community operation out of necessity. Every hand counted. Timing was everything. Cut too early and the grass was thin, low in nutrients. Cut too late and the weather might turn. A few rainy days could rot the cut hay, forcing the farmer to start again or lose an essential portion of his winter feed. The Graga's law code contains detailed provisions on haymaking, including regulations about shared meadows, grazing rights, and theft. One such law warned against cutting another man's hay in the night, a sign that midnight hay theft was a known temptation in a land where grass might mean life or death. Some meadows were held in common almenningsengi, but even these had rules, first cut rights, boundaries, and time restrictions. Violating those rules could result in fines, not unlike theft. In fact, hay theft was not considered petty. It was treated almost as seriously as livestock theft, because to take another man's hay was to risk the lives of his animals come winter. It was, in effect, stealing time. Harvesting without tools of precision. Haymaking in medieval Iceland was done by hand, no plows, no balers, no horses pulling mowers. Instead, men and women used eljar, long-bladed iron scythes, often custom-fitted to the user's height and strength. A skilled cutter could clear a sizable patch in a day, but most fields were irregular, shaped by rivers, hills, and rock outcroppings. Cut grass was left to dry in the field, but Iceland's humid climate and unpredictable summer rain made drying a risky process. Hay had to be turned repeatedly with rakes to avoid rot. If a downpour came unexpectedly, the hay might mold and become unusable. Farmers often built temporary covers from sod-end wood lean-tos to shield haystacks from weather, though this was labor-intensive and not always feasible for large harvests. Once dry, the hay was bundled into stacks called haygardar, often protected by turf banks or built near the barn for easier access. In some areas, hay was even transported by boat from distant meadows, small islands, or isolated valleys where grass grew wild, but was difficult to reach. Transport posed its own challenge. With few roads and no wheeled carts in early Icelandic history, farmers relied on sledges or pack animals, usually horses, to move hay to winter storage. Every trip required planning. The weather had to be dry, the path clear, and the labor coordinated. A poorly timed haul could spoil the entire stack. The hay barn, Iceland's first vault. The storage of hay was perhaps as important as the cutting. A heilaða hay barn was not a casual shed. It was often the second most important building on a farmstead after the main house. In wealthier households, hay barns were partially sunk into the ground, with turf walls and thatched roofs for insulation and protection from damp. Their location was critical, close to the house and stables, but far enough from the cooking hearths to avoid fire risk. The amount of hay stored by a household was a direct indicator of its winter survival chances. Farmers often calculated the winter in feeding weeks. A cow required a certain number of bundles per week. Multiply that by the number of livestock and the projected length of winter, and you had your survival math. If the hay ran out too soon, options were few. You might cull animals, slaughtering some to save the rest. You might barter with neighbors, trading tools or goods for a few armloads of feed. But such trades were expensive in lean years and often made in desperation. One law in Gregaz even allowed for a kind of moral trespass. If a man's animals were starving and he had no other option, he could let them graze a neighbor's field. But he had to declare it publicly, and he would owe a fine or a share of his own livestock at spring. This was Icelandic law's way of balancing compassion with accountability. Social consequences of a poor harvest. In a subsistence economy, failure had ripple effects. A poor hay season might not lead to immediate famine, but it could shift the social landscape. Families that failed to cut or store enough hay might be forced to give up independent status. In Icelandic society, being buandi, a landholding farmer, was not only an economic position, but a legal one. Only such individuals could attend things, bring lawsuits, or represent others in legal matters. Those who lost their land or could not maintain enough animals through winter often became tenants, leiguliðar, or laborers, vinumen, living on the land of others. Over time, this could degrade their legal and social standing. Thus, hay was not just a winter concern, it was a political resource. We even see this reflected in the sagas. Men rise or fall based not on battles or inheritances, but on whether they maintain their herds, cut their hay in time, or survive a particularly brutal winter. The line between prosperity and ruin was often no thicker than a strand of dried grass. A boring task with high stakes. It is difficult to overstate the banality and the drama of haymaking. From the outside, it may seem like the most ordinary of agricultural tasks. Cut grass, let it dry, stack it. But to the Icelanders of the 11th and 12th centuries, it was the heartbeat of life. A successful hay harvest meant warmth, food, milk, and calves in the spring. A failed one meant slaughter, shame, dependency, or worse. And yet, despite its importance, haymaking received no epics, no sagas, no songs of glory. It lived quietly in the law codes, in the rhythms of the farm, and in the generational memory of every family that had once watched the sky and prayed for sun. But how did this rhythm change in later centuries? What did technological advances, shifts in climate, and evolving property law mean for hay storage and survival? Did the haystack endure, or was it replaced by something else entirely? In the first part of this story, we explored the foundations of Iceland's medieval hay culture, the urgency of the short summer, the law's protection of meadows, and the community effort required to gather and store enough fodder for the winter. Hay was the economic lifeblood of the farm, but it was also a system of values, a way of organizing survival, kinship, and legal order. In this section, we turn our attention to the slow but steady evolution of haymaking across the centuries. As Iceland changed through climate shifts, foreign influence, and legal development, so too did the practice of harvesting and storing hay. We will examine how external pressures, internal reforms, and subtle technological shifts altered this seemingly timeless process. And yet, at every stage, the land and its limitations continued to exert quiet power over the choices of Iceland's people. Climate change before climate change. It's tempting to think of climate change as a modern problem, but medieval Icelanders faced their own long environmental crisis. Beginning in the 13th century, a gradual cooling trend now known as the Little Ice Age began to affect the North Atlantic world. Winters lengthened, summers grew shorter and wetter, glaciers advanced, hayfields shrank. For farmers dependent on tight summer windows to cut and dry grass, the impact was enormous. Historical records show repeated famines in Iceland between the 1300s and 1700s, many of them directly linked to failed hay harvests. In bad years, farmers might lose half their herd to starvation or slaughter. The response, however, was not industrial adaptation. There were no machines to introduce, no synthetic feed to import. Instead, Icelanders returned to strategies of extreme efficiency. Increased attention was given to Udengi, the outer fields, often wild or marshy lands far from the home farm. These required long journeys, risky crossings, and careful management, but they offered crucial supplementary fodder in lean years. Some families even cut grass from near volcanic areas, where geothermal heat allowed for extended growth. Others turned to losagras, the mosses and rough herbage that grew along high ridges or cliff sides. Law codes were updated to reflect these shifting realities. New clauses in later versions of Jonsbok describe rights to outer hayfields, obligations to maintain paths or bridges for hay transport, and adjustments to grazing rights based on snow coverage and ice damage. The rhythm of the hay was still dominant, but now it had to dance with a colder, less predictable tune. Imported ideas, local resistance. From the 14th century onward, Iceland fell increasingly under the control of the Norwegian and later Danish crowns. These external powers brought new legal systems, new trade expectations, and, eventually, new agricultural methods. By the 17th century, some Danish administrators encouraged Icelanders to adopt techniques from mainland Europe: crop rotation, clover planting, even attempts at artificial drainage and fertilization. In theory, these improvements could increase hay yields and reduce dependency on unpredictable natural meadows. But uptake was slow. Iceland's environment was too unique, its soils too volcanic, and its social structure too decentralized for foreign agricultural reform to gain much traction. Most farms were small, isolated, and oriented toward subsistence, not market production. Labor was limited, and hay was not a negotiable crop. It was a survival requirement, not a commercial one. Some techniques were gradually absorbed. By the 18th century, turf-covered hay barns had improved insulation and airflow. Stone foundations replaced all-earth floors to reduce moisture buildup, and farmers became more adept at reading the weather, adjusting cutting times, and making small gains in efficiency. But there was no haymaking revolution. Iceland adapted in increments, not upheavals. Even in the late 1700s, most of the tools used would have been familiar to a 12th century farmer: scythes, rakes, sledges, and guesswork. Communal memory and intergenerational knowledge. What Iceland lacked in technology, it compensated for in memory. Haymaking became an inherited science, passed down through families not as innovation but as continuity. Fathers taught sons how to test grass dryness by the sound it made in the hand. Mothers taught daughters how to bundle hay tight enough to shed water, but loose enough to breathe. Children were raised on stories of the great hay year, or the black summer, or the neighbor who once lost an entire winter's feed to an early storm. Oral culture, so vital in saga literature and law, was just as important in agriculture. Farm records were kept by memory as much as by ink. A good farmer was not necessarily an inventor, but a custodian of accumulated techniques. Some farms even developed unique local customs. In northern Iceland, it was common to dry hay on elevated wooden racks haystarar to improve airflow. In wetter western regions, some families used raised turf platforms to keep hay above the saturated ground. These were not universal methods, but they reflected localized adaptation and deep environmental awareness. These small adjustments, passed through generations, allowed Icelanders to maintain the hay rhythm even in increasingly difficult conditions. Hay and hierarchy, social structures of storage. Hay production also revealed and reinforced social divisions. Not all farmers had equal access to fields, labor, or storage capacity. Wealthier farmers might control both home meadows and udingi, giving them greater yield and more margin for error. They could afford better barns, more pack animals, and hired help to rush in a second cut before early snowfall. Poorer farmers relied on less productive land and might be forced to graze animals early into hay season, reducing yields further. Some households had to store hay in outdoor ricks more vulnerable to mold, theft, or trampling. These small disadvantages compounded over time, creating a cycle of dependency. Icelandic law recognized these disparities but didn't always correct them. Tenant farmers were often required to turn over a portion of their hay yield to landlords as rent. In bad years, this burden could push a family to the brink. In extreme cases, entire households dissolved, children sent to fosterage, adults seeking work on richer farms. Hay was thus not just an agricultural product, but a mechanism of economic mobility or immobility. Even among freemen, hay determined status. A man who consistently produced surplus hay could offer hospitality, sustain larger herds, and take on social obligations. A man who failed was less eligible as a legal representative, less likely to marry well, and more likely to slip from independence. Laws for living grass. Throughout these centuries, haymaking continued to be reflected in law not as a quaint tradition, but as a live matter of policy. Even as centralized courts developed and church law expanded, the hay remained a legal object. Field boundaries were recorded and inherited. Disputes over harvest dates or grazing overlaps reached the thing. Theft of hay bales or haydles could carry heavy penalties, and the valuation of land still often referenced how many animals it could support bustafnsmat, or farm stock assessment, with hay yield as the central variable. Interestingly, the law was flexible about new hay-related problems. In the late 1600s, as storms became more severe and livestock losses grew, some regions introduced emergency regulations allowing communal redistribution of stored hay during disaster winters. These emergency statutes, often local, informal, and temporary, reflect a social ethic deeply tied to survival. Hay was property, yes, but it was also lifeline. A subtle transformation. By the 19th century, change did arrive. Agricultural reformers, both Icelandic and foreign, introduced new grasses better suited to Iceland's cold climate. Horses began to be used for field cutting and hauling. Simple hay forks and carts reduced labor burdens, and centralized records of harvest yields were kept in parish books and government surveys. Still, the basic structure remained: cut, dry, rake, stack, store, hope. The rhythm had stretched but not broken. Hay was no longer the only source of winter feed fish meal. Imported fodder and grain supplements began to appear. But for most, hay remained essential. And perhaps more importantly, hay retained its symbolic power. It was still the test of the farmer, the measure of the household, the shape of the summer. But what happened in the modern era as Iceland urbanized and mechanized? How did haymaking evolve with the advent of tractors, silage, and global markets? Did the ancient rhythm finally fade, or did it simply shift key? As Iceland moved into the 20th century, the old agrarian world of scythes, hayricks, and weather-watching farmers began to shift under the pressures of modernization. The traditional rhythms that had dictated life for centuries, cutting hay in July, storing it in turf barns, and measuring wealth in fodder, began to adapt to new tools, new policies, and a changing economy. Yet despite these advances, hay did not vanish from Icelandic life. It simply evolved. The old rhythm slowed, bent, restructured, but it never fully disappeared. This final section traces the journey of Icelandic hay culture from the first tractors to today, exploring how technological innovation, global trade, and even climate change have reshaped but not erased one of the oldest seasonal rituals in the country's history. Mechanization arrives. In the early 20th century, Iceland, still a largely rural society, began to mechanize its agriculture. The first tractors arrived in the 1920s and 1930s, imported from Scandinavia and Germany. At first, these machines were rare, costly, and confined to the wealthiest farms. Most hay was still cut by hand or with horse-drawn mowers. However, by the 1950s, powered mowers, rakes, and eventually balers became increasingly common across the countryside. This allowed farmers to harvest larger areas in less time, reducing the labor burden on families and increasing overall yield. Mechanization also meant that timing became less precarious. A field that once required several days to cut by hand could now be mowed in an afternoon. This shift represented more than just technological progress; it fundamentally altered the rhythm of haymaking. With machines, fewer people were needed. Children no longer had to rake fields all day. Elderly family members were no longer expected to haul hay bundles to the barn. Hay became less of a community affair and more of a task managed by a single farmer and a few tools. Yet the stakes remained high. A wet summer could still ruin a harvest. Machines broke, fuel ran low, and the weather, indifferent to progress, continued to turn quickly. The rise of silage. One of the most transformative changes to Icelandic hay culture came with the widespread adoption of silage in the 1960s and 1970s. Silage is fermented, high-moisture fodder stored in airtight conditions, often wrapped in plastic or kept in underground pits. It differs from dry hay in that it does not need to be fully dried in the field before storage. For Iceland, with its unpredictable summers and frequent rainfall, this was a revolution. Silage harvesting allowed farmers to cut grass earlier, bale it faster, and avoid the risks of mold and rot caused by extended drying times. The need for long, sunny days, a constant worry in traditional haymaking, was greatly reduced. Wrapped silage bales, often seen dotting the Icelandic countryside like giant white marshmallows, became a symbol of modern rural life. Easier to handle, safer to store, and more nutritious for animals, silage quickly replaced traditional hay in many regions. Still, old habits died hard. Some farmers continued to store small quantities of dry hay alongside silage, both as backup and out of tradition. The smell of sun-dried grass in a turf barn still held emotional weight, and in some isolated areas, silage took decades to become viable due to cost and access. Land reform and state support. Modern Iceland did not leave its farmers to navigate these changes alone. Throughout the 20th century, the Icelandic government introduced a series of agricultural reforms aimed at improving food security and rural sustainability. Subsidies were offered for modern equipment, barn upgrades, and silage storage facilities. Cooperative farms and community machinery pools were established in areas where individual ownership was impractical. Agricultural education programs were expanded, and research into grass species better suited to Iceland's conditions was encouraged. Additionally, the state invested in infrastructure that indirectly supported haymaking, better roads, reliable electricity, and improved access to remote fields. This allowed for more efficient transport of fodder, less waste, and safer working conditions. Land use reforms also helped. In the past, hayfields were often fragmented or based on vague customary boundaries. New cadastral surveys and legal protections allowed for clearer property lines, fewer disputes, and more strategic field planning. All of this helped preserve the viability of haymaking in an increasingly urbanizing society. And while many young Icelanders moved to Reykjavik or abroad for work, those who remained on farms were better equipped and more resilient than their ancestors. Environmental change, a new hay dilemma. Just as Iceland's farmers began to master the modern rhythm of hay, a new challenge emerged: climate change. Unlike the Little Ice Age, this time the climate was warming. Summers grew longer, winters shorter. Grass grew faster in the early season, but so did weeds. Late summer storms became more erratic. In some areas, invasive species began to disrupt traditional meadows. For a time, this warming trend seemed like a blessing. Longer growing seasons meant more cuts per year, higher yields, and more flexibility in timing. But the benefits came with instability. Pests previously unknown in Iceland, such as the European crane fly, appeared in fields and damaged root systems. Water tables fluctuated, impacting drainage. Soil degradation, often invisible, began to threaten long-term viability. In response, modern Icelandic farmers began to monitor soil health, introduce crop rotations, and experiment with reseeding programs. Research institutions partnered with agricultural collectives to track climate impacts and develop adaptive practices. Still, the basic problem remained. The hay must be cut, stored, and fed to animals each winter. The rhythm endures even as its tempo wobbles. From survival to symbolism. By the 21st century, hay had become more than just fodder. It was memory, culture, and identity. In rural museums, old scythes hang on walls beside wooden hay forks and rope-wrapped bales. In schoolbooks, children still read about midsummer cutting, turf barns, and family harvest rituals. In the language, hayskapur, haymaking, remains synonymous with seasonal labor, even if few now cut hay by hand. Some farmers stage demonstrations for tourists cutting grass with old tools, stacking bales in the traditional way, and telling stories of summers past. Others invite guests to stay on working farms during hay season, offering a glimpse into a rhythm that has not fully disappeared. In art and literature, hay remains a quiet backdrop. The field where lovers meet, the scent of childhood, the metaphor for preparation, patience, and endurance. And in policy circles, discussions about sustainability often return to this ancient task. Hay is a renewable, local, and low-tech form of food production, an idea whose time, perhaps, has come again. A return to the meadow. Today, if you walk through an Icelandic field in late July, you may still hear the hum of tractors, the rustle of cut grass, and the rhythmic clack of balers at work. You may see children stacking small piles, farmers testing moisture, dogs trotting between rows. You may notice the old alongside the new, a rusted scythe leaning against a modern mower, a turf barn long empty, watching over plastic-wrapped silage bales. The hay is still here, the rhythm is still beating. No longer life or death for most, but still meaningful, still tied to land, season, and memory. still a quiet reminder that survival was once measured not in coins or codes, but in the weight of grass carried home before the storm. Story 6. The Assembly of Stones, Althing Site Logistics and Sleeping Arrangements. Imagine standing in an empty, rocky plain. Wind pushes steadily across the open landscape. A stream murmurs nearby, threading its way through lava rocks and grassy patches. In the distance, fissures and ridges mark the tectonic divide where two continental plates pull slowly apart. You are at Thingvellir, the site of the Icelandic Althing, the oldest surviving parliament in the world. Today, Thingvellir is a national park, visited by tourists and honored for its symbolism. But over 1,000 years ago, it was a bustling, temporary city. Every summer from the 10th century onward, people gathered here not only to legislate and resolve disputes, but to trade, feast, camp, worship, and simply see one another after long isolation across the valleys and fjords. This section begins a close look at a forgotten side of this grand annual assembly, not the laws passed or the feuds settled, but the physical logistics of living there. What did it take to host a parliament in a windswept rift valley? How did hundreds of people find shelter, cook food, and stay warm for 2 weeks with no permanent structures? These questions may seem mundane, but in the history of the Althing, the boring details were often the most essential. The journey to Thingvellir. In a society of scattered farms, Icelanders spent most of their year isolated from anyone beyond their immediate neighbors. The Althing, held in June or early July, was one of the few moments when large numbers of people came together. Attendance was not universal, but it was wide. Every chieftain was required by law to attend. So were their followers, assistants, witnesses, and kin. Ordinary people came too, farmers with grievances, merchants looking to trade, women seeking divorces or property settlements. Some came purely to observe or reconnect with distant family. The journey could take days or even weeks, depending on location. Roads were little more than paths. Rivers had to be forded or skirted. Riders packed food, bedding, legal documents, and supplies. Those with wealth brought tents, though not the kind used today. These were often tea-jowled, made from heavy wool or skins stretched over wooden frames. Poorer attendees slept under carts or rough shelters made from turf and branches. There were no inns, no public buildings. Everything had to be brought in, built, or improvised. Camp law in tent towns. By the time the Althing was in full swing, Thingvellir resembled a crowded encampment more than a legal chamber. Tents sprang up in clusters, usually organized by region or allegiance. Some were simple family shelters. Others were elaborate compounds, chieftains' booths with cooking pits, food storage, and guards. The law books even mention booth ownership. Permanent rights to space at the Althing site were recorded and passed down, just like farmland. A chieftain's booth might be used only once a year, but it was a symbol of his power and place in society. Some booths were semi-permanent foundations made from stone or turf, topped with canvas or wood. In Gragaz, the medieval Icelandic law code, there are detailed provisions about booth rights. A man could not set up his tent in front of another's booth entrance. Disputes about space or proximity were handled by the lawspeaker or local judges. If someone set up camp in the wrong place, he could be fined or told to move. Even sleeping arrangements had legal implications. Witnesses in trials needed to be easily located. Messengers had to find chieftains quickly. A legal summons might be invalid if delivered to the wrong booth. These were not casual encampments, they were part of the judicial mechanism. Food, fire, and trade. Feeding several hundred people for nearly 2 weeks in a remote area with no infrastructure was no small task. Most travelers brought their own supplies: dried fish, smoked lamb, hard bread, skyr, a thick dairy product, and ale in barrels. Wealthier attendees brought livestock with them, sheep or even a milk cow tethered near the booth. Cooking was done over open fires, usually built in protected pits. Wood was scarce, so turf and dung were often used as fuel. Smoke management was an issue: too much, and your tent was unbearable; too little, and your food stayed raw. In addition to personal provisions, the Althing served as a major trade fair. Merchants came with goods from coastal trade or foreign ships: cloth, iron tools, honey, wine, and luxury items. Others sold necessities: firewood bundles, spare cooking pots, wax for sealing, or extra tent stakes. Legal cases often dragged on for days. During downtime, people visited these traders, swapped news, played board games, or listened to skalds recite poetry. The Althing was not just a court, it was Iceland's social calendar condensed into 2 weeks. Water and sanitation, or lack thereof. The Irksara River, which runs through Thingvellir, provided the camp's water supply. People used it for drinking, washing, and watering animals. However, with so many people in close quarters, sanitation quickly became an issue. There were no latrines as we understand them. People relieved themselves behind rocks or in nearby bushes. Downwind was ideal. The same water used for drinking might easily become contaminated downstream. The sagas and law codes are largely silent on this topic, perhaps out of modesty, or simply because it was considered too obvious to mention. But archaeologists examining Thingvellir have found soil samples that suggest heavy use of specific areas for waste disposal. It's likely that part of booth placement strategy involved wind direction, proximity to clean water, and avoidance of known waste zones. Again, the boring details mattered. A poorly placed booth might mean days of foul air, swarms of flies, or sick livestock. Sleep and safety. Sleep at the Althing was difficult. The summer sun never fully set, especially in the north. There was no true darkness. Booths were crowded and noisy. Fire, smoke, conversation, drunkenness, and domestic animals created an atmosphere closer to a market than a monastery. Security was another concern. Feuds were common. Although violence was officially banned during the assembly, that did not stop all attempts at revenge or intimidation. Men slept with weapons close at hand. Booths were sometimes guarded, especially during major legal disputes. Some attendees brought dogs for protection. Others posted night watches. Despite this tension, most people understood the importance of keeping the peace at Thingvellir. A breach of the peace at the Althing could bring heavy fines, exile, or even execution. The law created a zone of fragile neutrality, but only as strong as people's willingness to obey it. Still, accidents happened. Fires broke out. Tents collapsed in storms. Animals escaped. Sleep was light and often short. But for many, the discomfort was worth it for political opportunity, for trade, or for the chance to see friends and kin from distant parts of the island. A temporary city of law and noise. As you imagine the medieval Althing, try not to picture a silent, solemn place. It was noisy, crowded, and earthy. Fires crackled, children shouted, dogs barked, traders shouted prices, poets sang verses. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, livestock, and food. And yet, within this temporary city, the laws of the land were made and enforced. Booths of turf and cloth held more legal power than castles. Agreements whispered over ale held weight in court. And sleeping on straw beside your kin might determine the fate of your land, your marriage, or your freedom. But how did this temporary city manage its internal disputes, feuds, accidents, thefts, and maintain order year after year? What mechanisms existed to resolve conflict among hundreds of people gathered in a lawless space meant to enforce the law? In Section 1, we explored the rough contours of life at Thingvellir, the booths, tents, meals, and fires that created Iceland's most important temporary settlement each summer. This section deepens the narrative by examining how such a law-focused gathering handled its own logistical and social conflicts. The squabbles between booth neighbors, the brewing of disputes, the thefts and brawls that inevitably came with crowds. How was law maintained in a place dedicated to lawmaking but lacking walls, cells, or police? And how did people find justice when things went wrong inside a legal assembly? The Althing wasn't just a court, it was a paradox, a place of law in a land without enforcement. The paradox of law without state. Iceland in the medieval period had no central executive authority. There were no kings, no sheriffs, no standing armies or prisons. Justice, instead, was a function of honor, family networks, and compensation. If you wronged someone, they brought a case against you at the local or national assembly. If you were found guilty, the penalty might be a fine or outlawry. But crucially, enforcement was private. The state did not collect fines or hunt down outlaws. It was up to the aggrieved party and their kin or allies to see that the verdict was upheld. At the Althing, this created tension. Hundreds of people, many with old grudges, gathered in close quarters. While the law banned violence at the assembly, it relied entirely on social expectation and threat of later reprisal to keep the peace. There were no guards patrolling Thingvellir. Instead, there was the threat of reputation. Breaking the peace at the Althing meant massive fines and disgrace, not only for the offender but for their entire family. This made most people cautious, but not all. Booth disputes and encampment etiquette. The law codes detail specific rules about tent and booth placement. A man could not build a booth too close to another's. If someone set up in a spot that blocked a path or fire outlet, they could be fined. But enforcement was tricky. Who decided how close was too close? Who counted steps or determined obstruction? Booth disputes were common. Fights over tent space, noisy neighbors, or stolen supplies are mentioned occasionally in annals and saga fragments. If tempers flared, there were limited avenues for recourse. Formal complaint to the lawspeaker. One could petition the lawspeaker or a designated law council, but decisions took time and often required witnesses. Legal summons. If someone damaged your tent or property, you could summon them to court. However, this meant delaying justice, since the court schedule was already packed with high-profile cases. Public shamming. In minor matters, the most effective route might be public complaint. Announcing loudly that someone had violated booth customs or disrupted camp life could hurt their reputation. These were not ideal solutions, but in a society where honor carried real weight, they were often enough. Theft and property at the Althing. With traders, travelers, and wealthy chieftains all concentrated in one place, the Althing was a tempting site for theft. Booths were made of canvas or turf hardly secure. Animals were tied outside. Wagons sat unattended during speeches and trials. Despite this, widespread theft seems to have been rare. Icelanders took the sanctity of the Althing seriously, and the punishment for theft there was severe. Under Gregos, stealing at the Althing could be punished by double restitution compared to theft elsewhere. Dishonor, making the thief unfit to testify or hold legal power. In some cases, full outlawry, which meant being legally killable on sight. The risk outweighed the reward for most. However, not all thefts were cut and dried. Accusations of theft could be used as weapons in feuds. Imagine accusing your neighbor of stealing a cooking pot, knowing the charge would ruin their legal standing. As always in Icelandic law, the burden was on the accuser to bring proof, witnesses, or oath helpers. And if someone was wrongly accused, their only recourse was to countersue. Conflict within the lawmakers' ranks. Even among the elite Gathar or chieftains, tensions simmered. They often arrived with entourages of armed men, supposedly to assist in legal matters. But in practice, these retainers could be used to intimidate rivals. Saga literature is full of scenes where tense encounters at the Althing come close to violence. Two chieftains pass each other near the booths, each refusing to give way. A man serving a legal summons is shoved or insulted. A fight breaks out over seating during a public trial. A servant accidentally spills ale on a rival's cloak. These moments were often loaded with meaning. In a society without uniforms or officials, clothing, posture, and speech conveyed status. A slight in the legal square might lead to feud elsewhere. Still, the Althing was expected to remain bloodless. Major violations of the peace could lead to banishment from future assemblies, a political death sentence. This kept most conflicts at the level of posturing or legal threats. But not always. Murder at Thingvellir. Though rare, there were cases of violence or even killing at the Althing. One famous example comes from the Njal saga, where Flosi Thordarson and his allies are involved in a killing at the assembly site. The act is depicted as a terrible violation, sparking national outrage. The killers are pursued, and some are eventually executed. The story emphasizes not only the violence but the disruption of legal space. This reflects a deeper truth. While Icelanders respected the Althing, they feared what could happen when respect broke down. An attack at the site of the law was not just a crime, it was an attack on the fabric of society. For this reason, even the most vengeful families usually waited until after the assembly to settle scores. The peace of the Althing was fragile, but it was vital. Medical and emergency needs. With so many people gathered in close quarters, accidents and illnesses were inevitable. People fell from horses. Children got burned in cooking fires. Others suffered from exposure, hunger, or exhaustion. Yet the Althing had no organized medical service. Care was provided informally, often by women or elders with knowledge of herbs and poultices. Saga passages occasionally mention healers attending to wounds during the assembly, but always in private tents, using personal tools. If someone died at Thingvellir, it posed logistical and legal problems. Burial at the site was rare. Families typically transported the body home, but a death could affect ongoing trials, inheritance claims, and family honor. Some sagas even use the image of a corpse on the edge of the Rift Valley as a metaphor for justice undone. Nightfall and surveillance. Despite the Althing being a place of law, its organizers had little power to watch over people. There were no guards, no patrols. Safety came from customary behavior, what had always been done. Reputation systems, fear of becoming dishonored. Mutual surveillance, the knowledge that everyone was watching. In this sense, the Althing was a panopticon without walls. You were always in view. Your actions were recorded not on parchment, but in memory, shared, repeated, and, eventually, written into sagas. This social gaze was enough to keep most in line. Children, games, and everyday life. Amid the legal wrangling and social tension, there was also ordinary life. Children played on the rocks, dogs chased sheep, women embroidered or traded goods. Adolescents flirted between tents. People brought musical instruments, dice games, carved chess pieces, and story scrolls. Skalds recited poems near fires, while elders told tales from previous assemblies. Even in its busiest moments, the Althing remained a human place, uneven, dusty, complicated. The daily grind of eating, sleeping, arguing, and making do continued even as national decisions were made steps away. The law was not above life, it was embedded in it. As we've seen, the Althing was held together not by infrastructure but by shared expectations, fragile trust, and the constant threat of reputational ruin. But that raises a new question. What happened when those expectations began to erode? As Iceland moved toward foreign rule and central monarchy, how did the Althing change? Did it keep its grassroots character or become something else entirely? In the previous sections, we examined the physical logistics of Iceland's medieval Althing, how tents were pitched, food was cooked, and order was maintained in a sprawling encampment with no walls, guards, or central authority. We saw how law, even in a stateless society, was enforced through memory, tradition, and the fragile threat of social shame. Now, in this final section, we explore the long trajectory of the Althing. its transformation from a rough-hewn outdoor assembly to a more bureaucratized body under foreign rule, and its eventual reinvention in the modern age. We will also reflect on what it means for a nation to have been governed in the open air, by consensus, argument, and endurance, and how those sleeping arrangements beneath the stars were part of the fabric of democracy. The Althing and the coming of royal power. The medieval Althing functioned as a legislative and judicial body within a decentralized society. But by the late 13th century, that society began to unravel. Feuds grew bloodier, enforcement weakened, and powerful families clashed. Eventually, this instability led to the Old Covenant, Gamli Sat Mali, in 1262-64, when Icelanders formally submitted to the Norwegian crown. This marked the beginning of royal influence in Icelandic legal life. Gradually, the Althing lost its independence. Laws were now issued by the king's scribes. Judges became royal officials. The lawspeaker was replaced with a royal lawman. But for a time, the site and structure of the Althing remained intact. Thingvellir continued to host the gathering, and Icelanders still arrived on horseback with tents and bundles. The booths of turf and rock were still claimed and maintained. People still camped in the Rift Valley, shared food, and listened to speeches. Yet something was changing. The law was no longer truly theirs. It now came from far across the sea. The rise of bureaucracy and the decline of booth culture. As the centuries passed, the Althing became increasingly ceremonial. While legal cases were still argued and sentences passed, true power lay with royal officials. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the king's envoys brought printed laws and bureaucratic procedures that required desks, papers, stamps, and witnesses. This change in function brought changes in form. Booths became more standardized. Stone and turf gave way to simple wooden structures. Attendees began to stay in rented booths, not family-owned ones. Camp life became more rigid. Officials were separated from the crowds. The role of kin, networks, and legal disputes diminished. The Althing was no longer a gathering of equals under open sky. It had bureaucrats, clerks, and increasingly, a sense of hierarchy. By the 19th century, only a handful of families maintained traditional booths, and the once bustling tent city had thinned. Still, people came. Even when the laws were foreign, the land was familiar. Thingvellir remained a place of memory. The dissolution and return of the Althing. In 1800, the Danish king formally abolished the Althing. Iceland's parliament was dissolved, its powers transferred to royal courts in Reykjavik. For nearly half a century, Thingvellir fell silent. The booths were abandoned. The walking paths grew faint. But the memory remained strong. In 1843, after political pressure and growing national sentiment, Denmark agreed to re-establish the Althing, now as a consultative assembly in Reykjavik. Though no longer held outdoors, its legacy was clear. Icelanders still saw themselves as heirs to that thousand-year-old tradition of meeting face-to-face in the elements to settle their future. Eventually, in 1944, Iceland became an independent republic, and the Althing was reborn as its national parliament, now housed in a stone building in downtown Reykjavik. But every year, the nation still marks Thingvellir as a site of pilgrimage and pride. And the old sleeping booths. Many were restored in the 20th century as historical monuments. Their turf walls speak not of kings or conquests, but of cold nights, shared meals, and whispered arguments that shaped the fate of a nation. The echoes of a sleeping assembly. What can we take from this? The idea that governance can be temporary, mobile, and communal is foreign to most modern political systems. Today, we associate parliaments with marble halls, microphones, and strict schedules. But for centuries, Iceland was governed by people who camped together, who cooked their meals beside the very site where justice was decided. That proximity mattered. It meant that power was not distant. If you had a grievance, you could walk to your chieftain's booth and speak with him. If your cousin was on trial, you might sleep one row away from his accuser. Law was not only written, it was lived. The details of that life, straw bedding, smoky fires, icy mornings, may seem mundane, even boring, but they were essential. They created a world where law and daily life were inseparable. Democracy beneath the stars. In a sense, the all-thing was democracy in its rawest form. Not the polished rituals of modern parliaments, but a rugged, participatory, often uncomfortable gathering of people who cared enough to show up. The sleeping arrangements in this light were not secondary. They were the foundation of trust. You couldn't hide in a private office. You couldn't retreat behind guards or gates. You heard the snores of your rivals. You saw the weariness in their faces. This closeness, born of shared hardship, shaped the decisions made in the daylight. It humanized opponents, softened disputes, and turned law into something tangible. Perhaps that is the lesson Thingvellir offers us today, that a political system must be rooted in human connection, not just institutions, but a sense of shared space and time. Even if that space is cold, wet, and smells faintly of sheep. The booths remain. If you visit Thingvellir today, you can still see the outlines of ancient booths, small rectangles of turf, low and quiet. There are no judges sleeping there now, no merchants shouting prices, no children running past oxen, just grass, stone, and wind. And yet in that stillness, you can almost hear them, the murmurs of argument, the laughter around cooking fires, the solemn voice of the lawspeaker. History in Iceland is not found in grand monuments, but in places like this. Open fields shaped by those who once lay down upon them, tired but resolute, ready to speak their truth.